So I'd love to welcome you all in person, but unfortunately we're a bit tight for time in our workshop. So I'm going to proceed fairly quickly, but I am going to premise this by saying that I have Brandon assisting me again with the slides. And the reason that I do this is because I'm based in Iraq, and every now and then we get these power cuts. Now, if that happens while we're online, I will rejoin you in about 2 or 3 minutes, but Brandon will take over from me. So please don't stress if I cut out, although inshallah things will go okay. So welcome to this workshop. This is our opportunity to start thinking about how we want to look at the practical application of the Common M&E framework. And I think one of the things that I want to really emphasize here is the application of the framework differs. Everybody uses it slightly differently. And that's okay, because it was always intended to have an element of flexibility in there so that the framework could still be used no matter what type of program you're doing, the type of people that you're serving, the type of interventions you're undertaking, and the type of organisation that you're working with. So what I introduce here may be a bit different to how other people come up with a framework and an application from the other work groups that are happening at the same time. So I'd like to also encourage you that when these videos come online, look at a couple of others, because the way I apply the framework is different to the way Sarah Harrison or Ashley or Zinab or others can apply the framework, and everyone is right. There's different approaches and different ways you can think about the framework. So I'm going to dive pretty quickly into the first couple of slides. The next slide that I'd like to just describe to you, I'm just setting up my system here a little. Where am I? So the next slide that I wanted to just say is you can remember that the M&E framework comprises at the moment of goals, outcomes and outputs. There are 6 impact indicators at the goal level, which would measure impact that you're having at community or person-centered level. And then your outcome indicators are what you would choose that are more specific to the type of program that you're implementing. Always, your proposals, your programs may need to use different words. So sometimes there's a vision, and maybe that's your replacement of a goal. Sometimes your objectives might be called outcomes, and sometimes your outputs might actually be your activities. There are lots of different ways, but the reason that we made this a skeleton type of framework with these 3 main levels and the indicators only at the goal and the outcome level is so that you've got flexibility to apply it as you need to. So in the next slide, I just want to remind everyone, this is our common framework. You saw this in the introduction. We've got our goal statement, we've got our 5 outcome statements, and then there are indicators for each of these areas. On the next framework, we've got a little, this probably shouldn't be titled rationale for MHPSS. It should be more about the way that you apply it. So what we want to see is from that framework of the previous slide, we want you to look at applying the overall goal of this framework to your program. We would like you to select at least 1 goal impact indicator. So maybe that's functioning, maybe it's symptom reduction, maybe it's about social behavior or social connectedness. Depending on the type of program that your goal is, you can word your goal so that it meets the framework's goal, and you can choose 1 goal impact indicator. And then what we recommend is that you select at least 1 recommended means of verification from that goal impact indicator, and at least 1 outcome indicator from the common framework. So you need to achieve the outcomes to achieve your goal. So if you are measuring your goal with an indicator and a means of verification, therefore you're measuring impact. But we also want you to look at a common outcome statement, which should lead to the achievement of your goal, and then a common indicator so that we're starting to build that body of knowledge across MHPSS in emergencies. Next slide. When you get a chance to look over the M&E framework, it's available now online, multiple languages. I really encourage you to spend some time looking carefully at this particular diagram. This diagram talks the framework to your MHPSS programs. So this is the actual steps that I want to work through with each of you today, here and now. So the first step is that your programs, your MHPSS programs, should always, as always, be based on a clear needs assessment. Your programs should always ascertain what are the needs of the people that are affected by the crisis and what are the key issues that need to actually be addressed. That's always the first and foremost thing. We need to design our programs, as always, based on the MHPSS needs of the affected people. And what we want to do is create some kind of draft logical framework. So you're going to assess needs, you're going to have some sense of what you want to implement and what kind of program you want to design. And then that moves us on to our next stage, which is stage 2, reviewing the program design with the common framework in mind. So how might you reword, or how might you reconsider your vision or your goal? And how might you consider your outcomes so that you are including an aspect of the overall goal statement, a goal impacting given their living situation, and they did not now, the original log frame didn't look like this. So in this annex example, in fact, in all the annex examples, they're based on very real live programs. But in this annex example, you can see how we applied the framework to this type of program. So in the next slide, I'm going to skip this slide. Thank you, Brandon. In this next slide, you can start to see how wording from the framework doesn't also have to be exact. So let me give you an example. We have the program goal. Remember, the program goal of the framework is about reduced suffering and improved mental health and psychosocial well-being. Well, in this actual slide, you can see that we've used those words, but we've applied them directly and specifically to this population group. So it would have been reduce suffering and improve mental health and psychosocial well-being among the women, because the women was our target group in this. I would have put the name of the refugee camp, but let's just, for the sake of argument today, call it the ZAL community. Outcome A is also another example where we've used one of the outcome indicators. People feel safe and protected. So the outcome is worded a little bit differently, but again, we changed it slightly so that we're actually still using the same outcome statement, but we're applying it directly and specifically to this kind of program. So let's go back to the goal a moment. we're saying that the goal is about reduced suffering and improved mental health and well-being. Now, we want to actually ensure that the women in this community feel safe and that we are caring for their mental health and psychosocial well-being. Now, you can see that these are the indicators from the 6 common indicators. So we have the 6 common indicators of reduced symptoms. We have the common indicator of I'm going to forget it now. Ability to cope, feeling safe, feeling calm, feeling etc. We took the element of safety from that indicator of ability to cope. And then we also took the indicator for functioning. Under outcomes, we have an outcome indicator that is about the knowledge and the knowledge for prevention of risks and referral. That's a direct outcome indicator for outcome 2. And the percentage of women who feel safe. So we've kind of repeated that outcome indicator. This is also a little bit of an example where some of these for outcomes might have some crossover goal indicators. And you'll see throughout the M&E framework that that actually occurs. You'll also see under outcome A, we've got the percentage of women who after training use new skills. So there's elements of our outcome that aren't in the M&E framework. So M&E program, your MHPSS program doesn't necessarily have to be exactly everything M&E framework. Mitigation activities that we're doing in collaboration with WASH. So for example, we're ensuring adequate lighting in WASH in latrines and wash facilities. We're trying to implement a smartphone safety strategy. Now, these outputs we would measure according to whether or not we actually implemented these, but these would lead to whether or not the indicators come and then indicators to the goal were actually achieved. We can move down a little bit to outcome B, because outcome B also shows you how we've used an outcome statement, in this instance, outcome 5, where we're focusing on the ability of the therapy workers who are trained in basic psychological first aid and brief psychological interventions to be able to deliver competently the interventions to the women that are affected. So again, you can see that we've got them in here from the framework, also a couple of indicators that don't relate to the framework, but relate to aspects out. So your outputs feed into your outcome feeds into your goal. Your indicators of your outputs were delivered will tell you whether or not your outcome indicators were delivered, and then whether or not your goal indicators were delivered. So it's kind of a logical framework that works from the bottom up. In the next slide, you can kind of see that, let's do the animations here, Brandon. I think I was looking at the means of verification. Thank you, that's the only animation. So you can see that we've selected some of the means of verification that come from the framework. So the WHODAS, which is the WHO Disability Assessment Schedule, that will tell us how to measure functioning from the goal indicator. We've also got barriers to assessing case evaluation, care evaluation. So that's part of the anti-stigma program in the program to ensure that people feel comfortable to receive the psychosocial support that they're being offered. That's also from the M&E program. But this community survey of women and their subjective well-being, there are some recommended MOVs in the framework for this, but we didn't think that this was necessarily directly related to our program. So we opted to do a separate survey. You'll also see that some of these aspects of means of verification combine the quantitative and the qualitative. This is really important. I think a lot of people put far too much emphasis on quantitative measures, number of symptoms reduced or number of symptoms improved, but actually that feeling of well-being, that sentiment, that idea that I feel safer than I did before, that is just as, if not more critical than some of those numbers that we deliver. And so you can also see that there's this process of combining quantitative and qualitative assessments. And you can see this also in the outcome means of verification. So we've got focus group discussions that will give us some of that qualitative data. And we're also accessing means of verification that are program specific. For example, client records or weekly information that are collected from therapy sessions. So I guess I want to emphasize here the importance of using the framework to best suit your needs and to ensure that it's done in a way that makes sense to your program. We don't just take the means of verification or the indicators from a framework and say that's our program. You first of all have your program that's based on your needs. You have a sense of what you want to do. You can put it then into some kind of logical framework or a theory of change, and then relay that back. Go back to your M&E framework and say, well, I think we could apply this aspect, but not that aspect, and actually do some kind of combined approach of your unique program needs and the M&E framework. So in the next slide, I wanted to just emphasize that once you've decided on what your indicators are, and once you've decided on your M&E, your means of verification, you can actually go to the MHPSS.net website. They've got there a full downloadable PDF of all of the means of verification of the goal impact indicators. And they've also got those available online. So you can see here that we could actually click on functioning and get access to the WHODAS. We would also get access to scoring information about how to score that and how to actually apply that particular means of verification. The next slide is just an example of the many different types of resources that are available on MHPSS.net. And I actually spent about an hour just exploring some of these resources the other day. It's really impressive. So you can actually just home in and get the information that you need, but there's also some articles in there and some ideas in there about some of the pros and cons of these approaches, some of the previously used information when, you know, these means of verification have been used elsewhere. It's a real wealth of information that's available on this site. All right. Now I just want to focus on these next steps. So the next step is that you want to actually look at how you're going to collect your data. And this is where the guidance of the M&E framework is really important. You can't just go out and collect information about depression on people. You actually need informed consent. You need to train your data collectors. What if your data collector meets someone who says they want to take their own life? Your data collectors need to know how to deal with that. You need to think about the ethical issues. In this example we've used around sexual violence, there's a lot of really confidential information here that could actually be detrimental to individuals if it got into the wrong hands. So what are we doing about the protection and the storage of data? And what are we doing about the safety of the people that we're working with and the safety of our data collectors and staff? Think about how the data is going to be used, the accuracy of the data. We need to make sure that everyone's collecting data in the same way. Whether that data can be generalized overall. So would this data from this refugee camp be representative of all women in Darfur? The answer to that is probably no, but it probably depends also on your sampling methods. So there's lots of other additional aspects that we need to think about when we're applying the framework and actually doing the work. On the next slide, we think a little bit about what we're going to do to enter, analyze and record our data. And I encourage you to look into the guidance on that. I won't go into that in any major way, But I really want to emphasize here that there is absolutely no point in subjecting people to data collection if we're not going to use their data and if we're not going to report on their data or learn from their data. We're dealing with people's emotions, we're dealing with people's lives. So we don't want to be intrusive and ask them things about information that we don't need. It's really important that we think carefully about what we're going to do with their information and how we're going to use it. And then that leads me to my next slide, which says we really want to think about how you use the data and report on it. So yes, you're going to want to report on the data for your own program and maybe your donors and maybe your organization. That's really critical. But I would say to you what's more critical is that you're sharing this data with the community and the people that you collected data from, that people in the community have access to the information that you've collected and that they have access to the same learnings that you do. So you've asked them for their informed consent, you've asked them to contribute. It's really important that you also share the results with the respondents and the communities affected. Finally, it's really important that you share this data with others. So this includes about your means of verification. So what I want to say here is, you know, if one agency is working in Syria right now and they're applying the HUDAS in a particular language in a particular way, another agency shouldn't have to duplicate that work. If you've shared the information about your means of verification and your findings and what's working and what needs changing, you're going to potentially save other people lots of funding, but also the affected communities from having to redo and duplicate things with everybody asking the same questions. So we would really encourage you to also share your results and share your learnings much more widely. And there's lots of ways that you can do that. You can publish data, you can put it on your web pages, you can share it on the MHPSS platform. It doesn't need to be an official document for that to happen. You might also want to share it with working groups in countries. So in an emergency, if there's a cluster system that's active, you might also want to share it with them. So that's a little quick outline of how I went about applying the M&E framework to a real example. Similar to the framework, it still retained that unique programming element of the unique program being implemented, but it managed to integrate aspects of the M&E framework so that we were still able to tap into that common goal and to tap into common outcomes, indicators, and means of verification. So that's the end of my time. I don't think we have too much more time, but I'm really happy to open the floor and see if there are any questions that others have or comments that others would like to share.
We have 5 minutes extra for questions, Ali and Amanda said, so yeah, any questions would be great.
Excellent.
Hi, Alison. Sorry, I haven't raised my hand. Nice to see you and the rest of the panelists. I really appreciate the new revision with the MOVs, basically because they give us more guidance. And maybe just one challenge I am seeing of late since the launch, and people, for example, would want to run a patient health questionnaire as part of the assessment to understand you know, they think it's safely to use, you know, so they say, oh, it's good. Can we just run a patient health questionnaire and understand, you know, after the crisis, how many people are actually depressed so that we organize our programs? And I know that is not safe. I mean, it's potentially harmful to do that. And I just wonder how we safely ensure within the use of this M&E framework, people have a general understanding that these are not tools for you to use during assessment, for example. It's not tools for you to run how many people have impaired functioning because potentially of the harm. So I'm just wondering, what would be your best guidance? Because we have no control at times. how people use the M&E framework. Yeah, so I don't know if you have a quick way potentially that you can say, as you roll out in your organization, maybe take this into consideration or maybe provide additional information. Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that's really important to differentiate here is monitoring and evaluation is not the same as assessment. So when there's an emergency, there is an assessment requirement, and the assessment requirement is to look overall at the needs. And I suggest strongly that you can probably estimate most of the needs without doing too much in-depth research. We know what majority of people are going to need. And you would then work with your interagency working committee or working group on some kind of joint assessment. So assessment and monitoring and evaluation are completely separate. Well, they're linked, but they're separate actions, completely separate actions. The means of verification that we've provided here are to monitor and evaluate a program. So you shouldn't be applying one of the means of verification unless you're applying it to a program. So therefore, an assessment is not a program. An assessment is something that you do at different phases or at the beginning of an emergency to base your programming on. It's not what you would use to actually monitor the well-being of the whole population. So I suppose what I would advocate for most people to say to others who attempted to use these tools for big epidemiological studies, which we never recommend, no one actually recommends that, is to actually really emphasize that these tools are for monitoring and evaluation of programs, which means you're actually monitoring and evaluating the impact of something you're doing. They're not for assessment. Yeah, the epidemiological issue is a big one. It's been going on for a long time. I think most people who are well versed in emergency MHPSS work understand that that's not a recommended approach that we would use, but I hope that there's some words that you might be able to share with others to encourage them to take a slightly different approach. Yeah. I'm going fairly quick to see if I can maybe get a few more questions in.
Hi, my name is Patrick, and I would like to ask a question. Thank you very much for that presentation. It is a very good presentation. And when you talk about M&E monitoring and evaluation, at times you can do evaluation maybe at the end of a project or at the end of a certain activity that you have done. And at times you can do monitoring and evaluation progressively. As you are doing your activities, you can actually do it progressively. Now, what happens in terms of MPSS? Can it be done at the end of probably a certain project, or it can be done continuously?
Okay, so what you're identifying there, Patrick, is the difference between monitoring and evaluation. So monitoring is where you would actually assess something as you go. And I actually said this in the very beginning, where I actually believe that in MHPSS programming, monitoring is more important than evaluation. And I say this because you want to be implementing something that you know is having a good result and that you know is not doing harm. So monitoring is definitely something that you might do from week to week with therapy groups, or it might be or with clients, depending on your scenario. It might be something you do once a month in a small community sample. But you know, it depends on your program, the length of time, the number of people, etc. But certainly you would want to be doing gradual monitoring of all MHPSS programs in some shape or form. And then you either use that same data for your final evaluation, or you do a final evaluation that maybe you need to sample different groups, or you have a different sampling methodology. But fundamentally, the sum of your monitoring should be your evaluation really at the end. And this is where I find it very interesting that a lot of people bring people in to do an evaluation when in fact the monitoring probably should have been leading towards that end evaluation right from the beginning. But definitely MHPSS programs should all have good sound monitoring as part of their framework that's done on a regular basis.
Thanks, there's a question in
Thank
the
you.
chat.
Thank you, Alison.
Sorry, Patrick. There's a question in the chat I can read out for you, Ali, if you'd like.
Thanks.
Yeah, how do you handle sensitive information that may be potentially harmful to the community, like SV cases, which I think here means sexual violence cases, with reports of specific groups of people as perpetrators?
Yeah. So this is about, well, number one, you've got to deal with de-identification of information. So this is part of your ethical data collection. How are you actually collecting that information? How are you de-identifying people who've given their information? And how are you protecting? There's one really important file here, and that's the file that might actually link a name with an identification code, right? So you obviously only publish de-identified information. That's a given, but you've got to be really, really careful that, you know, there's extra security there if you need to actually allocate an individual to a code. And that's the one that should be under the greatest lock and key. I can't stress how critical that is for sexual violence in particular. I would also encourage that when you're publishing, you need to, or making public results, you need to think about the harms of different people and different groups and whether you have the potential to actually cause more harm or not. So if you are going to actually accuse people as perpetrators of sexual violence, that's a really big statement. You might really want to think about whether there are some legal implications to that. And you might also want to really think about whether you're creating more conflict or contributing to peace. So I think there are a lot of decisions that you need to make in the process of dealing with very sensitive information. I do want to use a very practical example and say we had an experience in northern Sri Lanka many years ago where people were actually taking information from sexual violence victims, unknown from the victims themselves. Their information was being used in like an international criminal court as evidence of conflict, and then all programs in the north were shut down. Added to that, we were no longer able to do any psychosocial programs because people viewed psychosocial programs as politically motivated. So then we had to use mental health programs, which had a real trauma element. We got ourselves into all sorts of trouble then because we couldn't use the psychosocial elements. So you need to really think about carefully what the implications of the information that you're sharing and whether or not that's going to have long-term risks to the people that you're serving. I would say that's the case for any kind of program though. You know, like you have to be careful you don't say that about people who are stopping others from getting food or having access to water. I don't think that's unique just to sexual violence or MHPSS, but it certainly happens in our area of work. Okay, so I see another question that in the model implies that everyone in the world have the same representation of mental health. And the answer to that is it does kind of imply that, but it does actually go into details of saying that you might want to talk to the communities about how they perceive mental health. So if you are actually working with a community on a mental health program, they may want to design their own means of verification, which means you might be assessing what their own beliefs are about their symptoms of poor mental health. So it doesn't mean that in every program you're going to always find the identical issue in the corresponding means of verification. We did have to go with the majority of belief around what mental health is constructed as, but we do acknowledge that people view mental health differently, and that actually need to be accounted for. And you may need to adapt indicators or means of verification or
the extra time added up.